Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely got it correct. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am so delighted that you are here with me again this week. We are going to take and be responding to a number of the different feedback that I've received in respect to these sessions or this discussions that we're having on the national religion. It is so true that we do have religious practices being established at the federal level and that they're being funded, clearly funded in so many different ways. They think that they're skirting around the issue, but quite frankly, they're getting away with it for two simple reasons. One is that the Christian church, the denominations at all within the context of the United States has failed, amazingly failed, disgustingly failed in actually teaching the truths that we're trying to bring to you on this programming in relationship to the fact that there should not be the evil that is going on in the political arena, except for the fact that bad theology has been in place since the mid-1800s. I'm going to reference for you today, at this first segment in particular, some specifics out of Justice Joseph Story's commentaries on the Constitution. He's very specific in there, as well as other writers. Once again, I will be going to the Founders Constitution, looking at all the documentation around the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment portion. Also, we'll take a look during the program at some other websites. We'll look at something specific to Madison. We'll look at one site that actually is for law school students, as well as it should be for lawyers and judges. Not used very much, but a resource there, and is fundamentally ignored by those in the legal profession because they like allowing the evil to propagate itself and are contributors to it, quite frankly. So that we have that. Also, in the second segment, I am going to take us down the path of some of the things that are continuing to go on in the mental health industry, in that it is now promoting religiously the whole insanity of white supremacy and all that nonsense into drug and alcohol counseling. I'll be using a particular article in reference to that. Last segment, we'll see where we are on finishing up from the founders' intent for the First Amendment and continuing as a response to those that have taken and made comments in relationship to this nation being a Christian nation. The important areas that we need to look at here in particular are that assumption. The assumption that differentiates the question of what is a Christian nation. What is it that America, or the United States in particular, is looking at or defining itself, even from the Supreme Court decision back in the late 1800s. So we'll touch on that as well. But in particular, there's so many Christian organizations, especially out in the evangelical circles, that just are running around and saying, yeah, we're a Christian nation, are supposed to be. And that is like some kind of heritage. That's some kind of, well, it ought to be. Well, things not happen or ought not be because people don't apply the truth. They don't apply the necessary effort in what that means in its total context. So with this, in this first segment in particular, and probably carries over into the third, we're going to talk about Jefferson and Madison and some of the other founders in relationship to setting up that larger perspective as to what did it mean for tolerance in religion, and how did that become something that was fundamental within the context of the First Amendment. I just have to take the moment to say that there was a great amount of intolerance, if you will, within the United States at its formation, but it was across and within the context of what? The different denominations, or as they called them at the time, religious sects. That's sects. So that people clearly understand that it was from that theological position that some of that intolerance, if you will, carried over. And we'll see that even those that were highly tolerant, and we're not going to get into everything, but we'll see that the likes of even Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin were intolerant themselves of certain denominations and groups of how they approached and they tried to manage or impose their theological perspective. But we're then going to take and look at where we're going to start is with Joseph's story. So with that, let's get right to it now. And Joseph's story, as you'll see at samueladamsreturns.net within the blog posting for today regarding religious tolerance, and in the commentaries, I think it's extremely important to understand that the real object of the amendment, being the First Amendment, was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity. So I want to stop right there. So when we're talking about the First Amendment and religious tolerance, it wasn't to allow advance Islam or even Judaism or infidelity, because atheism is destructive to a free republic. You have to understand that, as well as Islam is destructive to a free republic. So it continues by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment, which would give to an hierarchy the exclusive patronage of the national government. It thus cut off the means of religious persecution, the vice and pest of former ages. I have to stop there and interject. So every pastor that is out there that says that we Christians must endure persecution in these United States is a false teacher. They're a liar. They're a deceiver. And I'm being strong on this because they are looking at Scripture that applies differently, but in the context of these United States, there is no reason for Christian persecution in these United States because of the First Amendment properly applied. Anybody that tells you the church in America has to endure persecution is a flat-out liar and deceiver. Joseph Story just wrote about it. So right there is that it thus cut off the means of religious persecution, the vice and pest of former ages, and of the subversion of the rights of conscience in matters of religion, which had been trampled upon almost from the days of the apostles to the present age. The history of the present country had afforded the most solemn warnings and melancholy instructions on this head. And even New England, the land of the persecuted Puritans, as well as other colonies where the Church of England had maintained its superiority, would furnish out a chapter as full of the darkest bigotry and intolerance as any which could be found to disgrace the pages of foreign annals. Apostasy, heresy, and nonconformity had been standard crimes for public appeals, to kindle the flames of persecution and apologize for the most atrocious triumphs over innocence and virtue. Story is talking about what even happened in the colonies of the day, even there in where we're talking about, and I'll jump over to Sam Adams in a moment, where the intolerance of the various denominations trying to maintain some sense of purity in their denominational thinking didn't have the biblical application in a view of what Christ was actually teaching. So we have that. But what we have is in depth is that freedom of total conscience, and everything that is happening right now from the federal government level, including pushing down their religion of idolatry, homosexuality, their whole issues of CRT and the white supremacist nonsense, and funding those areas is forcing religion and forcing the intolerance, is forcing the mechanisms that then will what? They will take and they will punish us, especially Christians, for the freedom of conscience that this First Amendment deals with. I can guarantee we're not going to have a lot of time to delve into everything that I have prepared for you. As always, we're down to the last 2 minutes already. So I guess we'll have to touch on some of this at the middle of the second segment, because I do want to cover this whole thing on the religious push now into the mental health industry, especially in drug and alcohol, and how they've changed the 12 steps of recovery. And then we'll carry on with the historical perspective in the third segment of the likes of Madison, Mason, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, and others, and what is true religious tolerance in America. Story says this, and this is in the beginning of the blog post there at samueladamsreturns.net. 1873, he writes, is that it was under a solemn consciousness of the dangers from ecclesiastical ambition, the bigotry of spiritual pride, and the intolerance of sex, thus exemplified in our domestic as well as in foreign annals, that it was deemed advisable to exclude from the national government all power to act upon the subject. The situation, too, of the different states equally proclaim the policy as well as the necessity of such an exclusion. In some of the states, Episcopalians constituted the predominant sect. In others, Presbyterian. In others, Congregationalist. In others, Quakers. And in others, again, there was a close numerical rivalry among contending sects. It was impossible that there should not rise perpetual strife and perpetual jealousy on the subject of ecclesiastical ascendancy. if the national government were left free to create a religious establishment, then this would be wrong. Come on back in the next segment as we pick all of this up, because Sam Adams has more to say, and we have a lot to deal with in relationship to Justice Story as well as others. Sorry I had to cut you off short, but come on back for the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely did get it correct. And I do have to apologize to you for cutting you short at the last segment as I was going through what Justice Story had to say. So let's pick that up and finish what he had to say in relationship to religious activities and denominational allowances within the context of the states. This is federalism. So this is what the enemy is fighting against right now when it comes to the whole abortion issue, is they don't understand federalism. And all of the liberal churches out there that are siding with the abortionist don't understand federalism. They don't understand any of this. And quite frankly, I will say it again, is those that are saying that persecution of Christianity is something that we should be expecting and accepting in these United States, they're false teachers. And I've said that for decades now, is that they're missing the mark because they don't understand the foundational truths of how things should work in America. Anyway, that goes to their eschatology, and I'm not the one that's going to get into that at this point. Maybe I'll do that when I start doing my daily little podcast things. So let's go back to, in some of the states, Episcopalians constituted the predominant sect, and others Presbyterians, and others Congregationalists, and others Quakers, and in others again, there was a close numerical rivalry among contending sects. It was impossible that there should not arise perpetual strife and perpetual jealousy on the subject of ecclesiastical ascendancy. If the national government were left free to create a religious establishment, the only security was in extirpating the power. But this alone would have been an imperfect security if it had not been followed up by a declaration of the right of the free exercise of religion and a prohibition, as we have seen, of all religious tests. And that, we've talked about religious tests that the Supreme Court is now using when I teach the federal constitutional classes, and we've talked about those also on this program. Story continues. Thus, the whole power over the subject of religion is left exclusively to the state governments to be acted upon according to their own sense of justice and the state constitutions. And the Catholic and the Protestant and the Calvinist and the Armenian, the Jew and the infidel may sit down at the common table of the national councils without any inquisition into their faith or mode of worship. So, once again, federalism is to be the determiner of any type of even state religion. So, for instance, California, New York, they fully instituted their atheist, what I said, their pagan, their humanist religions at the state level. Now, if some other state, like, say, Texas, Oklahoma, or whomever you would consider as a blue state, wanted to make that Baptist or Presbyterian or, Methodist or some other denomination as their key, they could do it. Story writes about that they can even fund it if they wanted to. So the whole misconstrued idea of this thing in the negatives that the Supreme Court has brought in on Thomas Jefferson letter relative to the states. Once again, they're falsely applying the 14th Amendment to the states. Therefore, they messed it up. It's the only way of saying it. And I'm pretty emphatic today because it's very, very critical that we have so many ignorant people in relationship to all of this. So I wanted to jump over real quick because I'm almost halfway through this segment already and haven't even touched on what I wanted to touch on in relationship to an article that I read on alcoholism and drug abuse counselors warn against white institutional values. Now, this is coming once again from the whole messed up, godless, pagan, humanist crowd of CRT folks. But it's the first time that this article, and it is a Breitbart article, very well done, that what we're seeing is a national institution, a group that is forcing religious practices into the medical industry in this forceful manner, quite frankly. So there's a guide titled Rehabilitation Addiction Treatment, an Anti-Racist Recovery Approach. And it warns against white institutional values and provides a 12-step guide to recovering from white supremacy. So it's a whole new 12-step program that's part of it. And this document was created by the NAADAC, whose mission is to represent the professional interest of more than 100,000 addiction counselors, educators, and other addiction-focused healthcare professionals in the United States, Canada, and abroad. So this is going global, ladies and gentlemen. It's going global. The scary part of this is that, as I've mentioned before, here in the county that I lived, when I was on the mental health board, we were trying to bring in true biblical Christian counseling that touches the very essence and the soul of a person. For recovery from addiction, it is not just feelings. It is not just medical. But what this is pushing now is into the depths of psychological. And as we get down a little bit deeper, it is actually spiritual. And they acknowledge it as spiritual. So now they are interfering in the freedom of conscience by pushing this the way that they are. And you have to look, and I'm not taking the time at the moment here. It's still a lot of effort to put together all of the people and organizations that are funded by state and federal government that are pushing religion, a false religion, that are pushing paganism and humanism and putting down Christianity. And you have to understand, what did Joseph Story say about that in the first segment? The whole idea of the First Amendment was just to qualify between the denominational differences and have no preference at the national level. Whereas we are having paganism and humanism funded and pushed and subverting everything about Christianity. Pastors, priests, rabbis, you're allowing it. You are allowing it because you don't know the truth. You think you do, but you don't. You don't put the whole truth together. Anyway, so anyhow, what this whole guide is, and it quotes here, it argues that at the heart of whiteness can be the, here we go, feeling of isolation, Relational intimacy in both the family and the community tends to be more surface level and lacking in deep closeness and belonging. And that's because you're white. Feeling over faith. I talked about that some last week. They're pushing feelings over faith. All right. Then it goes on to talk about white institutional values are contrasted with transforming values. Parentalism and power hoarding, for example, are contrasted with inclusive clarity and making sure that prioritizing the restoration of one's connection to their culture rather than appropriation of other cultures. No. Well, the fundamentals on the culture is, what do we believe? What is that worldview? I've talked about the worldview over and over. And without the Christian worldview, then you get all of this. The documents target white fragility, tells addiction professionals not to act or lead in dominating ways. One manifestation is centering whiteness. So this whole 12-step program that they're doing in this recovery from white supremacy is where you want to make it, the statement, we were powerless over white supremacy, that our culture had become unmanageable. So that's one of their first steps, one of their first tenets. And then their second step reads in their recovery, their 12-step program, came to believe that a collective conscience greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Holy smokes. Steps 4 and 5 call on participants to profess their guilt and participation in white supremacy. It quotes, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of our internalization of white supremacist values. That's step 4. Step 5 goes on, admitted to our collective conscience, to ourselves and to other human beings, the exact nature of our participation in white supremacy. Give me a break. And then it goes on, and here it is in the 12-step program, in the last 2 steps. Number 11 goes on to say, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious understanding of white supremacist culture, praying only for increased awareness of our agency to create change. So they're talking about you're seeking in this 12-step process about white supremacy through prayer and meditation to improve your conscious understanding. And finally, the last step calls on participants to be evangelists for anti-racism. Here's what it says. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, tried to carry this message to our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, these last 2 minutes, this is, again, that these folks are taking, and this is being injected as a racial politics into the medical as well as into the spiritual communities. I mean, we've seen CRT since COVID going into all the leftist woke church is all over this nation. Wow. Once again, I only can say is that they haven't read Joseph's story. In fact, all they're getting, even in law school and so on and so forth, is all the leftist, socialist, humanist, and even paganist or paganism that's being taught in universities, even in Catholic and Christian or Protestant education. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time that you say no. It's time that you take and you learn this. I know I take and I sit there and go, when do I have time to go through this stuff? Well, go to the references that are there at samueladamsreturns.net in the posting for today's program. eat the elephant one tail hair at a time. You're never going to get even to the meat and up the tail, but pull out a tail hair and chew on it. Use it as a toothpick if you have to. They're pretty darn stiff. But ladies and gentlemen, pastors, deacons, church leaders, church educators, until you understand that there should be no reason for persecution in these United States, you're never going to get it right. Come on back for the third segment when Samuel Adams returns. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment. Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists got it absolutely correct. This is Tom Navulis, your host. And as always, we have been going through a lot of information. And there is even more that is posted there at samueladamsreturns.net. And I think it's highly important that you go to those references. And as I was closing out the last segment, the second segment, that I hope those that are listening on the radio stations in the various markets out there that only get the first and third segment, that you would go to samueladamsreturns.net and listen to the podcast or watch the video when they're available, because then you get to see my smiling face, or in this program in particular, a not so happy face, because as I have been saying in the first and the second segment, that the reason we're experiencing what we are is because the fundamental churches, even the Orthodox, have not been doing their jobs, and they don't understand these truths. So with that, I don't want to belabor that any longer, but let's take another instance here, as I was talking about in the second segment. But here's a quick instance where just here on June 15th, 2022, where President Joe Biden took and signed an executive order directing the Department of Health and Human Services to develop guidance blocking federal funding for organizations that subject LGBTQ youth to what they're calling harmful and discredited practices known as conversion therapy. So here we have a flip where there was funding for taking and bringing people out of paganism and humanism. Let's just call it what it is, because that's where that all falls, is under paganism and humanism. And now is going after that. Well, let's talk about that from a truth perspective for just a quick moment. I think that all funding at the federal level for either side should be gone. Every single penny of the theft of our taxpayer dollars for any program in relationship to what's going on in the battle against paganism, humanism, or for fostering Christianity and moral spirituality under God's leadership, faith over feelings. Nothing should be done at the federal level. So both sides can be mad at me, and I hope so, because guess what? You don't understand how the federal government is supposed to operate, and you haven't understand what I was talking about in the first segment around Justice's story. So in relationship to that, we're just going to jump over to what Madison, James Mason, and some of the others were talking about in relationship to what does it mean from being declared a Christian nation, as well as what does it mean to take and have proper concepts of religious tolerance, as we heard in the first segment, and that's in the references at samueladamsreturns.net, where Joseph's story was saying it's not to build up Mohammedanism, atheism, or any of the other types of religions that do not have the fundamental contextual understanding of Christianity. No, this is all about taking in determining that we're not seeing persecution between denominational differences. Are there theological differences? Sure. That's going to continue to be until we all sit down and we have a good continual understanding of those scriptural truths. But it comes down to the freedom of conscience. And that's what Madison and Mason and the others were definitely driving on when they determined that what would be the First Amendment. So when it came to religious tolerance, we're going to take a quick look at what there is in relationship to that as George Mason began. Thomas Jefferson jumped in on, and when it came to the First Amendment, what Madison wrote about in particular. So what we're looking at is the whole concept that goes back, that was differentiating everything that was happening up to that point. It was what John Locke was even writing about, and Madison took and made some changes as the new Virginia Constitution was coming into play. And as that Constitution was coming into play, one of the persons that was writing the article in relationship to what was there in the Constitution was George Mason. And he was what he wrote, and he was the primary architect of the Declaration of Rights in there. And what he was writing in that Declaration of Rights was very specific. What he initially wrote was that as religion, or the duty which we owe our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate, unless, under color of religion, any man disturb the peace, the happiness, or safety of society or of individuals, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Now that was interesting. I mean, that was something that was just very, very fundamental. Madison was looking at it a little bit differently. Madison, when he was taking and looking at it, he says, that's good. It's really good. And what he then was thinking about, what is toleration? Toleration, as we are seeing in our present time, toleration can be dictated by the government. A made-up privilege or a made-up idea, not a fundamental right. Tolerance is something that can be instituted, or as the example that I gave you at the opening of this segment, in the executive order that Joe Biden is taking and he signed in June, is that tolerance can be taken away and substituted with another tolerance. Well, Madison got that. And when he was looking at it, he started going on the road of what is true religious liberty, not just religious tolerance, and that the state has no right or authority over it whatsoever. So it was inconsistent. When you give the government any leeway, it becomes inconsistent in the idea of freedom of conscience, and it becomes inadequate, is what Madison was talking about. So historically speaking, religious tolerance is to be contrasted with religious liberty. And that's you moderns. Us moderns We don't get it. We just, when we talk of religious liberty, we don't have that clear understanding. Now, Madison proposed a revision, and his revision actually was something that was punctuating the aversion to the concept of toleration with natural rights arguments that all men are equally entitled to a free exercise of religion. So what Madison was offering, he offered the amendment, and the way that he first suggested it was like this: that religion or duty we owe our Creator, and the manner of discharging it being under the direction of reason and conviction only, not of violence and compulsion, all men are equally entitled to the full and free exercise of it according to the dictates of conscience, and therefore that no man or class of men ought, on account of religion, to be invested with peculiar emoluments or privileges, nor subjected to any penalties or disabilities, unless, and then they went through and added, once again, that idea, if you go wacko, then that's a civil issue. If you're using religion to cause destruction, then it becomes a civil issue and should be dealt with accordingly. My goodness, that's what's going on out there with all of the pagans in abortion, all of the rampage. And there's a whole series of articles out there on the summer of rampage that is occurring right now civilly against even the Supreme Court justices in relationship to the abortion issue. Now, this becomes very, very critical as we look at what it ultimately means in taking and defining the federal government imposing, as I just said, religion on we the people. It's a violation of conscience. And this is where, again, I'm not going to get into it, but George Mason has a lot to say. One of the, I can't get into reading because we got this last 3 minutes. I just want to wrap this up. But everything's there in your references, some really great articles. One of the key references that I have there is an essay on the founder's tolerance. I highly recommend that you go read that. It's very, very long, but it gets into a good introduction, talks about Ben Franklin, Catholics, John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson, Madison on reason and tolerance, James Madison again on more, and then religious freedom at the federal level. So in the last 2 minutes, here's how I really like to conclude with you. And those that are watching or listening on radio have just seen, let's use the proper tense in English here, just have observed me taking my glasses off. So it's pretty darn serious here for the last couple minutes. Friends, all those that are listening on the Christian radio stations, I appeal to you to take the time and go to the references and clearly understand Joseph's story. I have it there in the body of the blog post in particular. Joseph's story wrote that there should be no persecution of Christianity. Everything that I was just reading from that adjustment in the Bill of Rights there in Virginia, when you look at the Bill of Rights of a number in the constitutions of a number of the other colonies, they all point to Christianity. So, is the United States a Christian nation? Well, is the United States having a solid freedom of conscience with the exercise of what? Our worship to our Creator. go to the Pew Reports and the other programs, you'd have to say no. So you need to take, and the job of we as individuals, as well as in particular is solid church leaders, is the true application of our orthodoxy, our biblical Reformation foundation into our constitutionalism as defined by story. Come on back next week, because we'll get into this a lot more when Samuel Adams definitely returns.